Welcome to the Australian Hiker Podcast, Australia's longest running hiking podcast, downloaded over 500,000 times in over 145 countries and providing you with an Australian perspective on all things hiking. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage.
This is episode 200 of the Australian Hiker Podcast, and for us this is a big milestone. It's very rare that episodes of any podcast get to 200, so we just wanted to celebrate this major milestone for us. We hope you enjoy. Before we get into today's episode, if you'd like to help support Australian Hiker and this podcast, there are a couple of ways that you can help us out. Firstly, by subscribing on your podcast host of choice so that each episode is available as soon as it's published, and if you have the opportunity, leave us a 5-star review. Another way to support us is go to the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au and click on the Support Us page and buy us a coffee. You can do a one-off donation or become a monthly supporter. All donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue producing this podcast and blog. Now let's get on to today's episode. This is the first episode of Australian Hiker Podcast, and to kick things off, we just wanted to introduce the podcast and the website to explain what it's all about. My name is Tim Savage, and I've been a hiker for almost 40 years, undertaking mainly day hikes for enjoyment, but with the odd multi-day trip interspersed.
Thanks, Tim, and I'm pleased to be here also. I'm Jill, Tim's longtime partner in everything, including hiking. Like Tim, I struggle to find gear that fits and is comfortable, but for completely the opposite reason. I'm not tall, but I probably do have large feet. Definitely not the size of Tim's, though. For me, hiking is a great opportunity to simplify part of your life. I like the fact that my mobile phone doesn't have a network connection when we're in the middle of a long hike. I like the fact that to make my pack light enough to carry on multi-day hikes, I need to jettison anything that isn't essential.
Now, by way of introduction, that short snippet of podcast, which was episode 0 that you just heard, we don't listen to it that often. But I must admit, we do cringe at it because it was our first formal episode or our first introductory episode. We did write down the text and read it, and it was very obvious, and we were very nervous about what we were doing. So hopefully we've come a long way since then, and we're a bit more fluid in what we're doing.
Well, that's one of the learnings, isn't it? And I think probably part of that is having that level of comfort and level of appreciation that you've actually got something of value to say.
Apart from being a bit of a hiking geek, I'm also a bit of a tech geek as well. So I'm into facts and figures, which helps when you're doing gear reviews. So there's estimated to be approximately 2 million podcast shows in existence these days, with the vast majority of these not being in production anymore. And I think the estimate is that there's roughly just over 500,000 of those that are still being actively produced. Many of these shows start with a flourish, but peter out after around 7 episodes once their creators realise the amount of work in getting an episode to air. And we'll talk about that in a bit more in a few minutes. As we said in the introduction, reaching 200 episodes really is a rarity. And while I do listen to some podcast shows that are over 200 episodes, there's not that many of them. So what we wanted to do today was just talk about the Australian Hiker Podcast, where we've come from, where we're heading to, and what we learned along the way. And just before we get into that, both Jill and I would like to thank everyone for their support in making this podcast a long-term success and looking forward to the next 200 episodes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not much of a podcast if no one's listening.
Now, as we said, 200 episodes, that really is a rarity for us. And we've been producing on average around about 3 episodes a month for almost 5 years. Our 5th anniversary is next month. So we've been producing for a 5-year period, and it's for us it's a labor of love. It's something we enjoy. As far as downloads are concerned, we have been downloaded over 650,000 times worldwide, 148 countries. Now, I must admit, I don't tend to game the system. If I looked at what classes as a country on podcast hosting services, I could probably add another 10 to the system. So as an example, Guam, which was considered to be part of the States, is also considered a separate country from a podcasting perspective. But I tend to ignore those. And there's a number of others that also fall into that sort of category. So I think we've sort of hit that plateau where it's pretty rare we get a new country that listens to us. As far as I'm aware, we aren't listened to in North Korea. But
do they have internet?
Well, yeah. Do they have internet? And I don't think
electricity. Do they have electricity?
And then they don't actually show up as being from there. So,
that's right.
I must admit, one of the podcasts I listened to from the States, for many years they were trying to get listeners from Cuba, and we do actually have listeners from Cuba. So we get some weird and wonderful countries and locations that people that listen to us.
Yeah, I think I would be a bit worried if we were being listened to in North Korea, just because of the inference of what that might mean, not necessarily because of North Koreans.
Now, as far as getting an episode to air, really, and this is one of the reasons that a lot of podcasts tend to stop and start. You don't have to spend a lot of money to actually get a podcast to air. You can do it relatively cheaply. I must admit, over the years, I've progressively increased the amount of tech. I've changed some things like microphones. I've now got microphone stands. So there's a number of different things that have changed for us over the years. I think certainly the main thing for us is trying to identify topics that we think that people will like, and that also that we want to hear as well. And sometimes we get it wrong in both directions. We have episodes where we think, look, it's something that's worthwhile talking about, but we don't think there'll be much interest. And it surprises us. It goes off. Or other times we think this is a really important topic that we need to talk about, and it doesn't get as much of a bump as we would expect. So it really depends.
Well, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that means that everybody's, 100% on it and don't need to listen to us about it.
Now, I think certainly while we're talking the facts and the figures as well, the number of downloads we average on a monthly basis per episode in the first month puts us in roughly the top 15 to 20% of podcasts, and this is all podcasts, not just outdoor podcasts worldwide. So
that's huge.
Yeah, we're pretty impressed with that. We're never going to be in the top 3%. Shows like Serial and Joe Rogan that are getting 1 million downloads in the first month of their episodes. That's not going to be us. But we're pretty happy with the feedback and the input that we are getting from people listening to these episodes. For me, the inspiration for a lot of podcast episodes tend to come at the strangest sort of times. Sometimes I'll see something and I'll think, oh, that makes sense. And probably one of our most recent episodes, episode 199, where I talk about hiking and plane travel, it's something I've been thinking about for a few years. And after doing a trip just recently to Tasmania, which involved plane travel to get to the trailhead, for hikers that are fairly keen and have been doing it for a number of years, it's not something you tend to think about. But if you're new to hiking and have never had to travel interstate or overseas for a hike, it's something that people may not be aware of. So we didn't expect this is necessarily to be the most popular with really experienced hikers, but certainly for newer hikers, we thought it would be. Yeah,
and, it's one of those things that it's difficult to turn it down, turn it back, send stuff home. So getting it right is the easiest way.
Now, we used to, when we first started off producing the podcast, I always tried to release the podcast on Wednesday mornings. And that meant for probably the first year or so, I was uploading and publishing the podcast anywhere between midnight and 2 a.m. in the morning. I was so fixated on releasing on a Wednesday that I would stay up that late to go through and do it. These days, I tend to release where I can late Tuesday night, and funnily enough, from my perspective, that means we actually get an increase in the people that listen to us from Western Australia who were still up and about at that time, as well as some of the overseas countries as well. So it's surprising what shifting a release of a podcast back 3 or 4 hours will do to the numbers that are downloaded.
And it's funny because, that release time, there's all sorts of, facts and figures around about the best time and, best day and all of those sorts of things. And I think we were trying to basically work out what would be best for us.
From a point of view of inspiration for the episodes, it really does vary. As I said, sometimes it's a bit like the episode 199 that I mentioned, that it's something I thought, inexperienced hikers may not know this.
But it's also a good reminder. It's also a good reminder for people who haven't been able to travel because of COVID, and we're opening up and they might have to, go through that learning experience again. So I think we thought that would be a good one.
And the other thing that we try to do as well is where possible, we try to get a series of related interviews. So this is interviews from hikers, from industry people, from people who have done some amazing hikes, from people who have produced hiking-related books and allied sort of areas. So it's sometimes these sort of things tend to come randomly. As this podcast goes to air, it's late October 2021, and I have pretty much got a podcast schedule set until June 2022. Now, some of those tend to be fixed episodes. They're very much time-focused, and they need to come out at a certain time period because of what they are. Others can be shifted quite easily. So if I find a really interesting interview or something's happened within the hiking world that's worthwhile discussing while it's still fresh in people's mind, we've got the flexibility to shift and move that. And in all honesty, I had an episode planned for last week that wasn't hiking and plane travel. And the main reason I swapped that around was it looks like we're sort of coming out of COVID. Plane travel's becoming more likely for a lot of us, and it was worthwhile and more timely to release it then. The other episode, which I had planned and had planned for a number of months, has now shifted to around about April next year. So it's the sort of thing that we can be flexible to a degree, and certainly if I do rely on people who follow us and send me emails saying, have you thought about that? And if the timing is right, quite often I'll bring it forward or put it somewhere a bit earlier. I try to, where I can, as I said, do book reviews, and I've done that a number of times. I don't necessarily review every book that we look at, but certainly if I think the topic is going to be interesting. And from my perspective, I think one of the most interesting book reviews that we did was a book called Perfect Motion by an author called John Lenine, who happens to live in Canberra as we do. And that was about his hiking background and also the impact of long-distance walking and what it has on you. And for me, that was a very relevant topic and something that I could never quite place a reason why I feel like I do when I long-distance hike, but this managed to explain it. So there's certainly some episodes like that episode. The one I did was earlier in the year with the cannibal convict, out of Tasmania, which was, for me, a very interesting episode and certainly one of our most popular. And it's funny, I find that our episodes, regardless of what they are, all get around about the same sort of downloads, give or take. Now, getting episodes to air, for a half-hour episode, it takes me roughly 35 minutes to record. And for me...
And me.
And Jill as well. I'm the one with the buttons, so I'm recording. But I think the other thing from my perspective is then the initial editing phase, which is a 3-to-1 ratio. So for a half-hour episode, it takes around about an hour and a half to put it all together.
It's a big commitment, though, isn't it?
It is a big commitment, and I then run through a post-editing process as well, just to tidy it up and get the levels, the sound levels, all balanced out as best I can.
To lift the volume of my voice to the volume of your voice, and we even sit here with the microphone really close to me and quite a way away from Tim. So even after we do that, we still have to run some software over the top to even out the voices.
So realistically, a simple half-hour episode in most cases will take around about 2.5 to 3 hours to actually produce and get to air. The more complex ones tend to be a bit different. So if there's an associated or an allied written article that goes with that, by the time I write the article, use that as a series of dot points to produce the podcast, that can take roughly around about 10 hours to get those sort of episodes to air. So it's not just a simple, this is a few minutes. And this is one of the reasons so many podcasters stop producing when they realize how much work is involved. Things we've learnt over the year. When we first started out, we weren't doing post-editing, and I was doing a lot of additional work in the actual initial editing process to get things to air. Even now, I tend to focus on some things rather than others, but I know what my editing process is like, and I can generally go through things fairly efficiently and get things done in a quite a timely manner. I've learnt that IT issues tend to be the big issue, and some of the more astute of you may have noticed that we were late getting our podcast to air last week by 2 days, and that was because of an IT issue. We're all Wi-Fi, yeah. With so many of us working from home, my Wi-Fi downgraded from high speed to a very low speed, and I was just physically unable to upload a podcast to the system.
No juice left to do it.
No. And when you're trying on a podcast to get it to the stage where you actually publish it, for me at least, ends up being between 500 and 1,000 megabytes. And if you don't have a decent internet, it just doesn't happen. So it was a bit of a learning process there, and as a result, we've now upgraded our internet to cope with that. When we first started off, we were using the wrong microphone. It was a really high-quality microphone, but one that was designed more for music rather than the spoken voice, and as a result, it tended to pick up a lot of echoing. So we, in the early stages of producing the Australian Hiker podcast, used to sit in our walk-in wardrobe and let all the clothing and the material absorb the extra sound.
Yeah, not very well, but yes, that people used to laugh when I would tell them that we were going to go and sit in the wardrobe for an hour or so.
We also discovered the post-editing process, which tended to balance out the voices a bit more and get rid of a bit of the background noise. That was around about episode 30. And again, quite an easy sort of process to deal with, increases the quality of what's being delivered without having to deal too much with any difficult process.
So I think the last thing for me that we learned was that, and this might sound surprising given that we've done 200 episodes and, hundreds of thousands of downloads, the thing that we did learn along the way was that people are actually interested in listening and interested in what you have to say. And, we've always been fairly outspoken and vocal about a whole range of different things. But I think early on we were really, really careful of, not wanting to offend or not wanting to get it wrong. Not to say that we didn't, because, there were a couple of times, some monumental ones where we did get it wrong and we had to go and do a bit of fixing of the podcast once it was released. But, that's a really interesting thing to, people are interested in you. They're interested in the perspective you have to say. They're interested in the speakers and the interviewees that we have on the podcast. So, I think that was it's an obvious one, but I think that was a big learning.
Now, one of the things that does surprise us is what people say about us. And, Jill and I enjoy what we do. We do it because of that, not because of what people think about us. But we really do enjoy reading people's reviews, particularly of the podcast and also on social media. So from a worldwide perspective, more podcasts tend to be downloaded through Apple than any other option. And certainly iTunes, which is now better known as Apple Podcasts, for us is certainly the biggest area where it's downloaded. We have been hosting for the last 2.5 years on Podbean, And certainly that is growing and increasing. But as I said, by far, Apple is certainly the biggest provider of people that listen to us. So I'd just like to read a few things that people have said over the last few months. And we've now got 305 ratings, which doesn't sound like a lot, but certainly it's a huge number. And we've got a fairly high rating. So we're never going to keep everybody happy all of the time, but certainly we realise that what we're doing and what you're saying about us means we're doing something right. From Ms. Lozarella, I must admit I love going through and listening. Absolutely love this podcast. It's fun, entertaining and informative about all things hiking. The only issue I have, and this is probably because I binge listen rather than listening occasionally, the host seems to love using the phrases "I must admit" and "go through," and I find it a bit distracting.
Certainly,
yeah. Other than that, it's brilliant stuff. Oh, and I wish they'd changed their transmission music back to the beautiful guitar music they used originally. Sometimes I listen at night and get inspired, and that short piano music blasts my eardrum out. We'll see what we can do on that. So, another one is great series for casual hiker and serious hikers. I've been listening to Tim and Jill's Australian Hiker podcast series since the beginning, and I love it. I especially like the range of walks they cover. This is not all about extreme hiking, but sensibly covers easy and accessible walks together with more challenging multi-day walks. The info they gather is invaluable. I particularly enjoy the on-trail episodes recorded in the field.
This one's from Aussie Listener 2020. Great Australian hiking podcast. Really appreciate having an Australian-specific hiking podcast covering both local, short walks and multi-day hikes across the country. Great reviews, insight and ideas for future hikes.
Okay, and that now leads us into where to next. And certainly, we're up front. We don't always pick the even though all those podcasts were 4 and 5 stars, we don't always get things right. And certainly I've been trying to improve as best we can and try and make things better as we go through. So while we tend to use the same introductory music and the same transition music, it is something I've been thinking of and will be looking at changing that because it's been on my mind as well. So I'll see what I can come up with on that one. As I mentioned, we've got a podcast schedule set out until the end of June next year, and I've got a number of episodes right the way through until the end of next year based on hikes and interviews that I've got lined up already. But I do appreciate people sending me ideas and thoughts for podcasts. I don't always manage to get to them. And as I said, because I've got some episodes scheduled 8-10 months out, it may be a while before I get to them. But certainly if they're a relevant topic, I will try and put them onto the list where I can.
Yeah, what's happening at the moment is that we're getting a lot of approaches from publishers who are wanting us to review books that are about to be published and maybe even interview the author of those books. So that's a really interesting one because it's becoming a little bit more of a diverse field. It's not just about people who are hiking, it's about nature and it's about all sorts of stuff. So we are trying to be a little bit selective, but that might also provide a bit more interest into the future.
One of the problems we have had, and certainly this is not purely related to just us, is the last couple of years between the fires and then COVID really has thrown my schedule out. Some of these podcasts that I'm releasing just now were scheduled for 18 months ago and just had to be changed. We will be doing a podcast series on bike packing in 2022. We will be doing a podcast series on hammock camping in 2022. And these were both series, and there will be multiple episodes, that I had actually lined up for 2020, 2021, and we just didn't have the opportunity to get out and get out and to actually access
like everybody else. But, we've been relatively unscathed in relation to some parts of the country. So, can't complain, hey.
So I am doing research on those now. I am doing a bit of gear testing now. So again, they're in the new year, and we'll certainly let people know when they're about to hit the air as well. All right. So as I mentioned earlier on, Jill and I would really like to say thank you to everyone for supporting us. We really do appreciate that you listen to us and continue to listen to us. We will strive to do better in everything we do. And we'll, if there's things that you'd
fix that music,
yep. If there's things that you'd like to hear more of, please let us know. We think we know what people want to listen to, but let us know. And if enough people, identify the same sort of topics, we know it's a goer. Okay, that's all for this week's episode. We hope you've enjoyed. Bye for now.
And bye from me. It's what's best for us.
Now, working out what episodes we do release, I mean, you
just ignore me. You do. You just kind of go on.
So what did you say?
Yeah, exactly. Just stop it.